and welcome to the episode number 2 of the Indologia Podcast. First of all, a big thank you to all of you who heard the first episode and who sent me your messages, the lovely messages and the feedback. It was much appreciated. Thank you so much for that. And before we start, whatever platform you're listening to this on, please follow me on that, like it, leave a comment, give it a rating, whatever it is. Every single thing helps me reach more people and talk about these important things that I really feel should be talked about. This certain episode is dedicated to all those people who love Britain, all those Indians who love everything there is about England. I'm sure you also know some people like that. Everybody does. People who say that, hey, the British were so good for India. They did so many things for us. The kind of people who like eating English breakfast, who idolize English celebrities and politicians, who genuinely think that it was a bad thing that the British left. The only other people who feel like this are the British themselves. Because many people in Britain believe that when they colonized India, it didn't really help their own country's economy. In fact, it costed them a lot of money and it was good for India. This idea is actually pretty popular in Britain. There was a survey done in 2014. The results of that survey showed that half of the British people thought that colonization was actually good for the colonies. Even former British Prime Minister David Cameron said that the colonization of India was a good thing for India. And of course, there are also the Indians, the brown sahibs, who think that the British were so good for us. Even if you point out all the treasures and the riches that the British took out of India, all the exploitation, that doesn't matter. You're just told to ignore it and focus on the things that the British built in India. The trains, of course, the trains. But did the British really build the trains for us? That is a question that not many people ask, and even fewer people are willing to answer. Because the railways were primarily built to serve British economic interests. They were very useful for the British to transport the raw materials such as cotton and coal and jute from the Indian hinterland to the ports so that they could be exported to Britain. This, in fact, facilitated the British Industrial Revolution and economic growth, while India remained primarily nothing but an exporter of raw materials, an unwilling victim of economic exploitation. How did it help the Indians? Besides, it's not like the British built these trains with their own money. The construction of the railways was a rather expensive affair, and the costs were borne by Indian taxpayers. The British government funded the railways through Indian revenue, which caused a heavy financial burden on the local population. They took the money of your ancestors, built the railways so that they could exploit the country and export raw materials out of India at a faster pace. But another argument that the colonized Indians give us is that the railways generated employment during the construction and operation. But what they conveniently forget to mention is that a significant proportion of the workforce was British or Anglo-Indian, which did not really contribute much towards improving the economic condition of the Indians. The Indian labor force was not helped at all. The British wanted the railways to be staffed exclusively by Britishers so as to, protect their investment. For instance, the signalmen and those who repaired and operated the trains could only be Britishers. This policy was implemented so strictly that even in the early 20th century, all the key employees from directors of the railway board to ticket collectors were white men, whose salaries and benefits were also paid at European, not Indian levels. They were being paid salaries at the British level. Just imagine this, that a ticket collector working in Bombay would be getting paid exactly the same amount of money that a ticket collector working in London be getting paid. And of course, whatever these employees earned in India was sent back to England. Even in the rare instance when an Indian was employed, they had to face an incredible amount of discrimination. And I'll give you an example. The starting salary of a British employee in the engineering services was about 60 times the average income of an Indian worker. So if an Indian worker was paid 1 rupee, the British person would be paid 60 rupees. 60. In the Tata Steelworks factory in 1921-22, the average salary of a foreign supervisor was 13,527 rupees a year. 13,527 rupees a year, a lot of money 100 years ago. What was the salary of the Indian employee? 240 rupees. The Indian guy is getting 240 rupees and the British guy is getting 13,527 rupees. Even then, the salary that the British guy was getting was twice the salaries that were being paid in America at that time. So for a certain position, whatever a person would get in America, in the US, would be half of what he would be earning if he were to come to India and do the same job. The British also did their best to stifle any sort of a progress that the Indians could have made on their own. For example, the railway workshops in Jamalpur in Bengal and in Ajmer were established in 1862 to maintain the trains, but their Indian mechanics became so adept that in 1878, they started designing and building their own locomotives. Their success increasingly alarmed the British, since the Indian locomotives were just as good and a whole lot cheaper than the British-made ones. So in 1912, the British passed an Act of Parliament explicitly making it impossible for Indian workshops to design and manufacture locomotives. And get this, between 1854 and 1947, almost 100 years, India imported around 14,500 locomotives from England and another 3,000 from Canada, the US and Germany. But not a single one was made in India after 1912. So all these Vande Bharat trains that are being made in India nowadays, they suddenly gain a whole lot of extra importance when you realize this fact. It is sort of a little part of the whole decolonization process that the country is going through right now. So let's be clear. The primary reason for the construction of the railways was British economic interest, mainly to connect resource-rich regions with seaports so that the raw materials could be exported out of India into Britain. This also meant that the parts of India that were not very resource-rich were left unconnected to the railway network, denying those regions any new benefits or opportunities that they possibly could have gotten. And even in the regions where the railways was introduced, the fare structure was so steep that it was far out of reach for any common Indians to travel by railways. Apart from its use in the economic exploitation of India, the railways also had another crucial use to help in the ruling of India. In 1843, Henry Harding, then Governor General of India, had argued that the railways would be beneficial to the commerce, government and military control of the country. And that certainly proved to be the case, as the British used the railways to keep a tight control in India. In case of a mutiny or a rebellion, they could quickly deploy troops and administrative personnel to suppress any dissent and maintain complete control. This dual role of the railways as a means of transportation and control was extremely crucial for the British and the success of the British rule in India. And of course, it goes without saying that all the profits that they earned from the Indian railways were sent back to Britain, benefiting the British economy rather than being reinvested for India's economic welfare. It was a splendid racket for the British because they made all the profits, controlled the technology, and supplied all the equipment. But for some reason, we are supposed to thank them for it. Okay, tell me this. Would you thank a robber who comes to your house, loots all your money, jewelry, but leaves behind the ladder that he used to climb into your house? Would you thank him? If not, then why would you thank the British for the railways? That was a very calculated investment by the British, which paid itself over many hundreds of times. And today, it's a pretty well-known fact. It's not some sort of a Hindutva fantasy or some new neo-Indian nationalistic narrative that the British impoverished India. This can be proved from the records of the British themselves. For instance, I'll read out this report by the collector of Bellary, A.D. Campbell. This is from 1823. Mr. Campbell in this report was very concerned about the dropping education level in his district. He was very concerned that the levels of education were degenerating and he blamed it directly on the rapidly increasing poverty in India. I'm, to be honest, quite surprised that a British collector had the guts to even allude to such a thing in his official report. He says, the degeneration of education is ascribable to the gradual but general impoverishment of the country. And who did he blame for the poverty? He says, the means of the manufacturing classes have been greatly diminished by the introduction of our own European manufactures. So the fact that the British people had introduced in India things that were manufactured in England, because India had a very rich history of manufacturing, the British squashed that. Instead, they made things in England, in Britain, and they imported them into India, which the Indians were then forced to buy. If you see the United Nations historical data from 1900 to 1960, you can see that for 3 decades up to 1928, and very likely much earlier too, India posted the second highest merchandise export surplus in the world. Second highest merchandise export surplus. Number 1 was USA, number 2 was India. Then why did India remain so poor? Where did all the money go? The reality is that raw materials were exported from India, as I said earlier, and finished goods were imported into India using locally collected tax revenue. First, they would take your raw materials, and then they would make you pay for the finished goods exported from Britain. And who benefited in the end? The British. The Political Economy of Growth is one of the most influential books ever written about the field of development economics. In this book, the author, Paul Baran, mentions something very interesting. He says 8% of India's gross national product was transferred to Britain each year. Can you imagine? 8% of your GDP being sent to another country. And as a result, for the first time in known history, Indians descended into poverty. For the first time ever in the recorded history, India saw poverty. And you can see this very well in the example of Bengal. To destroy the Indian cotton industry, the British destroyed the handlooms of the workers, imposed huge duties and tariffs on Indian cloth. They even broke the thumbs of Bengali weavers so that they could not work. And all this time, they flooded the Indian market with cheap fabric from the factories of Britain. This completely destroyed the Indian cotton industry. Under British rule, India's share of world manufacturing exports fell from 27% to 2%. The main goal of the British was to benefit Britain. They deliberately took resources from India as a part of the plan. And it was a very well thought out plan, as you can see in the speech of Robert Cecil, who was the Secretary of State in India in 1870 and later on became the Prime Minister. He had stated that as India is to be bled, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested. He's openly saying that India is to be bled, and by bled, of course, he means economically. The parts of India that were resource rich, that were economically rich, those were specifically to be bled the most. And right on plan, by the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's biggest source of revenue. Cecil Rhodes was known to openly say that imperialism was the answer to the problems of unemployed working class people in England who needed food. He believed it was the job of the colonial leaders like himself to take over lands to exploit and create markets for products from British factories. And that's exactly what they did in India. Thus, India became Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British exports, unwillingly, and the source of highly paid employment for the British civil servants. All of it funded by the Indian taxpayers. Even the barbaric, bloodthirsty Islamic invaders could not destroy the indigenous village economy, but it took the cunning and the greed of Britain's colonial wrecking machine to bring down India. Indians even funded the Second World War. Britain spent a total of £3 billion in the war, out of which £1.25 billion, billions with a B, was owed to India. It still has not been paid. Any such extraordinary expenses like wars were added to India's financial responsibilities. You drag us into a war, and then you made the financial responsibility of the war a big part of it. It was not even our war to fight. And when India could not cover those expenses using the money it made each year, it was recorded as a debt. And interest on that debt kept increasing every year. Imagine somebody asks you to lend them 50,000 rupees for building their house. So you give it to them. Not only do they never pay it back, any expenses they incur above 50,000, they put it on your account. And then they tell you that you have to pay interest, which is going to increase every year on it. Does that make sense? This is exactly what happened to us in the Second World War. During the approximately 13,000 days of British rule in India, ships sailed daily for British ports from all along India's coastline. They were laden with incalculable quantities of wealth and other valuables. An interesting story related to this tells you how much wealth was being taken out of India. As the British continued to exploit India and force millions of Indians into poverty, impoverished Indians started selling off their gold and silver savings to the British. This was then transported to the West. One of these ships was the SS Jairsopa, which, while carrying a cargo of silver, iron and tea from India to Britain, was sunk by a German U-boat in 1941. In 2011, an American exploration company found its wreck. It found the wreck of the ship on which all these things from India were being transported to Britain. It contained 200 tons of silver. 200 tons of silver on just one little ship. And what was the value of the wreck that they found? 150 million pounds. It was the exportation of Indian goods all over the world that helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution, as many strategic materials like iron came from the subcontinent. So please remember that Britain's Industrial Revolution was built on the deindustrialization of India, the destruction of Indian textiles and their replacement by manufacturing in England, using Indian raw materials and the export of the finished product back to India. British economist Angle Madison had pointed out that the British employees in the colonial government in India were paid very high salaries. The viceroy received £25,000 a year and the governors received £10,000 a year. But what happened to all that money? Was it ever spent in India? The salaries that the Britishers earned in India eventually went back to the UK, either as savings or to meet the expenses of their family members. In the interwar period, these amounted to about £10 million a year. As per Dadabhai Naoroji, they were at the same level in 1887 as well. £10 million today is more than $4 billion. Can you understand $4 billion going out of your country every year? And this can also be seen in the report that I had mentioned earlier by A.D. Campbell, who was the collector of Bellary. In his 1823 report, he says, "The transfer of the capital of the country from the native government and their officers, who liberally expanded it in India, to Europeans, who are restricted by law from employing it even temporarily in India, and daily draining it from the land, has likewise tended to this effect." What he's saying is that when Indians governed their own lands, the salaries that were paid to the officials was earned, spent and invested in India. Indian money remained in India and the country prospered. But the British officers and their employees who ran India now were forbidden by law to invest in or spend their money in India. Instead, they would send their salaries that were paid by Indian taxpayers back home. So a whole lot of Indian money would leave Indian shores every single year. When the British were in charge of India from 1858 to 1947, they used to send money back to the UK and they called it home charges. Very smart it was. This money covered things like paying off debts, providing pensions, covering the cost of India offices in the UK, buying military stuff, getting equipment for the railways, everything. Also, they mostly bought everyday things, weapons and ships from the UK. No money was spent in India. No money was allowed to remain in India. It would obviously would have made an enormous difference if India's huge international earnings had been retained within the country. India would have been a far more developed country with much better health and social welfare indicators. But there was virtually no increase in per capita income between 1900 and 1946, even though India registered the second largest export surplus earnings in the world for 3 decades before 1929. So while your export surplus keeps increasing, the per capita income remained the same. And neither did the British try to improve the living standards of the Indian locals. Campbell in his report says that in many villages where formerly there were schools, now there are none. And he says that learning had never flourished in any country except under the encouragement of the ruling power, and the support once given to science in this part of India has long been withheld. He also stated that out of the 533 institutions of education now existing in his district, Bellary, I'm ashamed to say not one now derives any support from the state. He's clearly saying that the British government is not doing anything for the education, they're not investing in human resources, they're not doing anything for the locals of India, which the earlier rulers used to do. And he mentions that. He says, there is no doubt that in former times, especially under Hindu governments, very large grants, both in money and in land, were issued for the support of learning. And he was right, because about a quarter to 1/3 of the revenue-paying sources were, according to ancient Hindu practices, assigned for the requirements of the social and cultural infrastructure. still the British overturned it all. This is the impact, the economic impact, the negative economic impact that the British had in India. But to counter that narrative, many people now say, but was India even rich? It is an utterly idiotic comment that many colonized Indians and deceptive foreigners make. And I'll give you proof for that. In 1993, Belgian economist Paul Biroch presented a detailed study of the world economy. It was called Economics and World History, Myths and Paradoxes. In that he said that in the year 1750, China's share of the global GDP was 33% and India's share was 24.5%. The combined share of Britain and US was 2%. Angus Madison, the British economist who I spoke of earlier as well, showed that India had the largest economy on the planet for 1700 of the past 2000 years. In the year 1600, when the East India Company was established, Britain was producing just 1.8% of the world's GDP, while India was generating 23%, which of course went on to become 27% by the year 1700. By 1940, after nearly 2 centuries of the British Raj, Britain accounted for nearly 10% of the world GDP, while India had been reduced to being a poor third world country, destitute and starving. In reality, far from being backward or underdeveloped, pre-colonial India exported high-quality manufactured goods that were much sought after by Britain's fashionable society, not to mention the rest of the world. The British elite wore Indian linen and Indian silks, decorated their homes with Indian chintz and decorative textiles, and they craved Indian spices and seasonings. For example, in the 17th and the 18th centuries, British shopkeepers would try to pass off poorly manufactured English-made textiles as made in India in order to charge a higher price for them. Nobody wanted to buy made in England textiles. Everybody wanted made in India. So the shopkeepers in Britain would just pass off made in England stuff as made in India. Such was the craze for everything Indian that in the 1830s, the Governor General, William Bentinck, had worked out a plan. He actually had pulled together a plan to dismantle the Taj Mahal and ship the marble to collectors in London. And to people who keep claiming that India wasn't rich, I want to ask, if India wasn't rich, why would Robert Clive, the man who's said to have laid the foundation of the East India Company, say at his trial that considering the quantum of wealth he had seen in India, he was astounded at his own moderation at not taking more. Robert Clive was so amazed by the wealth that was in India that he regretted that he did not take more, that he did not steal more riches from India. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had said with a great amount of satisfaction that the astonishing gold mine that we have discovered in India's hoards has put us in clover. They were just amazed at the amount of wealth they had come across. I doubt they were expecting this. When the first people of the East India Company set their foot on Indian soil, they were never expecting this. And once they discovered it, they did not spare anything. In the book The Rani of Jhansi, the writer D.V. Tamankar, he writes that during the capture of Jhansi, the British, led by Dalhousie, carted away all the valuable stuff, the jewelry, the gold, silver and the money. And by the end of the 4th day of looting, they had even taken away all the clothes and the beds, mattresses, sheets, blankets, carpets, even the hinges and bolts that were on the doors and the windows. They did not spare anything. And by the time the British were done with India, they left a society with just 16% literacy, a life expectancy of 27, practically no domestic industry whatsoever, and over 90% of people living below the poverty line. That is the legacy of the British. And while the people in Britain prospered, tens of millions of Indians died unnecessarily in famines. London ate India's bread while India starved. In 1876, a severe drought forced farmers in the Deccan Plateau into poverty and starvation, even though India then had more rice and wheat than it needed. But that did not matter, because the then Viceroy, Robert Bulwer-Lytton, gave strict orders that nothing should stop the export of these food grains to England. Doesn't matter if the Indians were dying, but the food that was being exported to England could not stop. This scarcity of food was caused by a huge export of food from India to be used by the British troops in the war and for the consumption of the general public of Britain. India exported more than 70,000 tons of rice between January and July 1943, even though the Bengal famine of 1943 was setting in. Winston Churchill turned down many pleas to export food to India to end the famine, and he declined all the requests, citing a shortage of ships. And at that very time, shiploads of wheat from Australia would pass by India on the way to England to be stored for future consumption. Some of that could have been sent to India, to the people who were forced to starve. But Churchill would not hear of it. This is the same Winston Churchill who had said that I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. Let the viceroy sit on the back of a giant elephant and trample Gandhi into the dirt. As a result of this decision of Churchill, by the autumn of 1943, Britain had stocked 18.5 million tons of food and raw materials for its 47 million people. 47 million people who were 14 million less in number than the people of Bengal. According to estimates, 7 million people died in Bengal, while Churchill was hoarding all the food and keeping it for the people of Britain. And on top of this, Churchill also pushed a scorched earth policy, or the denial policy as it was called. In coastal Bengal during the Second World War, the British were very scared that the Japanese would just land up in the east of India. So they forcibly removed boats belonging to the local population. You can imagine how important boats are in a coastal region. They are the lifelines. They're used to catch the fish for consumption and for selling. The British took away the boats. Then the police destroyed and took away all the rice stocks because they were scared that once the Japanese land, they would use all these food stocks for their own purpose. And this made the situation of the local people terrible. They did not have the boats to go and catch fish. They had no stocks of the rice. They had nothing to eat. Parents dumped their starving children into rivers and wells. Many took their own lives by throwing themselves in front of trains. Starving people begged for the starchy water in which rice had been boiled. Children ate leaves and vines and grass. People were too weak even to cremate their loved ones. On top of this, the burden of high taxes completely destroyed the purchasing power of the average Indian. And as a result, the annual per capita consumption of food grains declined from 200 kilo per year in the year 1900 to 157 kilos per year just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And it would fall even further to go down to 137 kilograms of food grains consumed per year in India by the year 1946. To understand how bad the situation was, you must know that today, no nation on earth, not even the most underdeveloped or impoverished nation, faces the situation that was as bad in India in 1946. It will shock you to know that Indian expectations of life at birth was just 22 years in the year 1911. Life expectancy of 22 years. In comparison, the life expectancy in India today is more than 70 years. Can you imagine this? 22 years in 1911. Today it is more than 70 years. There were 31 serious famines in the 120 years of British rule in India, as compared to a total of 17 famines in 2000 years before. In 2000 years before the coming of the British, there were just 17 famines, probably all natural. In just 120 years of British rule, there were 31. The largest scale famine ever to take place in India was under the British rules. None have taken place since. There's not been a single famine in India since the British left. And as I said before, when they left a society, a broken society with 16% literacy, a life expectancy of just 27, no domestic industry, and over 90% of people living below the poverty line. William Johnson Hicks, the British Home Secretary, had once said that we conquered India by the sword, and by the sword we shall hold it. I am not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. When the British themselves are so clear, they were so clear that they did not want to do anything for us, why are some of our people hell-bent on giving them credit when none of it is merited? The truth is that this colonial drain helped to create the modern capitalist world, from North America to Australia. Every single place where European populations have settled, it was developed thanks to this colonial exploitation. And no colonial exploitation was better, more profitable than the British exploitation of India. There is a lot of support for Palestine nowadays. Firstly, that right there is a power of the narrative. But Palestinian terrorists killed people from so many different countries, beheaded the Jews, raped their women, killed their babies, sprayed bullets on a music festival. And in a matter of a week, the narrative has the neutrals of the world rooting for the Palestinians, the people who had committed the crimes. Of course, Muslims all over the world have come out in support of the Hamas. And I have received many messages from people who ended up blocking or being blocked by their Islamic friends since they refused to support Palestine and, by association, Hamas. By the way, I haven't seen a single Muslim protest against the acts of Hamas, against the killings of babies and the abductions, or any Muslim organizations or even prominent Muslim personalities asking for the hostages, the Jewish hostages, to be released. I wonder what that tells us. But all this Muslim support for the Palestinian cause amuses me, because the biggest killer of Palestinians isn't really Israel. The biggest killer of Palestinians are other Muslims themselves, indirectly and directly. Indirectly by denying them shelter, of course. Egypt, Jordan, heck, even rich Islamic countries like UAE and Saudi and Bahrain could easily give shelter to the Palestinians and help them live better lives. But they won't. The Palestinians are, after all, a very useful tool to keep the Jews, the Israelis, in check. It is not this indirect killing that I'm speaking of when I say that the biggest killers of Palestinians are Muslims themselves. I am referring to the Black September, the events in Jordan that happened in the September of 1970, that Muslim leaders, especially Pakistani Muslim leaders, never want to talk about. To understand what happened during the Black September, we must understand a bit about the history of the Palestinians in Jordan. Many Palestinians arrived in Jordan as refugees after the formation of Israel in 1947. After the Six-Day War of 1967, about 300,000 more Palestinians fled into Jordan. The presence of these Palestinian militants led to a tense situation with the government of King Hussein. Palestinian guerrillas began interfering with highway traffic, controlling Palestinian refugee camps, even clashing with the Jordanian army, and systematically defying the government. Palestinian militant groups like the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine were launching attacks from Jordan against Israel, which, of course, Israel then retaliated to, making the situation even more complicated. To make the situation even more complicated, both Iraq and Syria supported separate Palestinian militant groups operating in Jordan. As a result, King Hussein was the target of two clear assassination attempts in 1970. In June, his motorcade was attacked. As a retaliation, the Jordanian army started shelling Palestinian refugee camps. Yes, the Jordanian army started shelling Palestinian refugee camps, just like Israel is doing right now to Gaza. Another assassination attempt was launched against the king in September, which the Palestinians openly claimed responsibility for. So finally, on September the 16th, the king ordered the formation of a military government in the country to restore order, as clashes with the Palestinian militants had gone out of control. After the 1967 war with Israel, the Jordanian army at that point, and the Air Force as well, was pretty poorly battered. So while the US and the UK supplied the equipment to Jordan, they also needed the manpower. So for manpower, Jordan turned to the biggest broker, the people who sell their souls, their country, their people too easily, the Pakistanis. Seeing the opportunity to make some money, the Pakistani army immediately dispatched a brigadier named Muhammad Ziaul Haq to assist the Jordanians. On September the 17th of 1970, King Hussein ordered the Jordanian army to target militants who were operating from the refugee camps. The man in charge of this Jordanian attack on Palestinians was the Pakistani Ziaul Haq. A Pakistani general attacked Palestinians. On September the 26th, the Egyptian president summoned the King Hussein and Yasser Arafat to Cairo to push for a ceasefire, which was signed the next day. Between 3,000 to 4,000 Fedayeen were killed. Civilian casualties are unknown, but they were a big number. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat later said that the Black September had killed around 25,000 people. The Black September operation, which was led by the Pakistani Ziaul Haq, had killed around 25,000 people, and this is from the Palestinian sources themselves. As the Israeli military commander had later said, Black September killed more Palestinians in 11 days than Israel could kill in 20 years. This, my friends, was the second episode of the Indologia Podcast. I hope you guys liked it. Send me your messages, give me your feedback. If you have a thought, something you want to say, send it to me and I'll read it out on the air. And I hope you're following me on all the social media channels, Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, WhatsApp, YouTube. I'm all over the place. The name is the same everywhere, Indologia, Indologia. Till the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.